For some reason, Christopher Nolan, known for gritty, quote-unquote realistic movies, has decided to make an epic fantasy movie, The Odyssey, starring everyone's favorite Bostonian, Matt Damon, as Odysseus himself. Now, they've released a couple trailers at this point, and while I have no doubt the movie's going to be competent and pretty good because it's a Christopher Nolan movie, a lot of the artistic choices that we've seen so far are, to put it honestly, abominable. They're just not good. So let's talk about those. This is What, Why, How, and that's what the video's about. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow. Okay, let's start with the trailer released just a few days ago. First, I want to talk about probably the most bizarre thing in this entire movie is the appearance of what I think are supposed to be the Lastrygonian giants. These are supposed to be cannibal giants on the island of Sicily, which, of course, if you know Sicily, doesn't look like that. I'm just now realizing how unlike Sicily it looks. So there's actually a theory, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but there's this theory that the Odyssey is supposed to take place in the Baltic Sea or the North Sea, and that's when, I think Christopher Nolan might be going with that theory, because all the sets in this movie, they're all foggy, all a bit chill and cold, a lot like the Baltic Sea or the North Sea, and in this shot, you can actually tell it's snowing. It's snowing in this shot. I'm not sure if anywhere on Sicily actually looks like that, but let's address the more important thing, which is the appearance of these Lastrygonian giants. So they're wearing what looks to be steel plate armor, and they got these bulbous bellies that are hanging out over their weird steel skirts, and it looks like underneath all of this they're wearing like modern skin-tight athleisure clothes. It looks, I'm going to talk about this more in the video, but there's such a thing as bad creative choices. So they're clearly not going for anything historically accurate at all whatsoever. They're wearing full plate armor. They've got these weird helmets that kind of look out of the new Lord of the Rings series. And look at their boots. So they got steel boots. Nothing like this makes any sense in this setting from a historical point of view. And the Odyssey did take place in a historical time period. Ancient Bronze Age Greece. Now, it was told a little bit later, after the Bronze Age collapse, and of course, it's fantastical, so there's like giants and giant monsters and stuff like that. So you can imagine there's some fantastical routes they could have taken for these guys, but this just doesn't look good. So it's going in obviously not a historically accurate direction, but the fantastical direction they're going is not good either.
Ill-advised, but valiant.
Here we see them in movement, right? How do they make this? They're not supposed to be like gods or anything. They're supposed to be cannibal giants. They look a little bit intimidating, right? Because they're so large and they just start chopping through Odysseus' men. But I feel like there could have been a million better costume routes they could have taken. It's not like there's a dearth of fantastical creature designs for Greek mythology properties, right? Just look at anything, right? You'll find plenty of giants wearing armor, giants and other designs. There's so many different creative routes they could have taken, but he decided to pick the worst one. I just don't get it. Okay, so the trailer opens with Odysseus recounting his story to Calypso, and we get a shadowy shot, a couple shots of the Trojan horse and the sacking of Troy. In marches a towering dude in unique armor who is supposed to be King Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks. Now, we don't get much from these shots, so why don't we refer back to a trailer they released a couple months ago where we can see Agamemnon much better. So clearly they're going for a sort of fantastical fantasy aesthetic, right? Because we do actually have surviving examples of armor from Bronze Age Greece, even from Mycenae, where Agamemnon was said to be king. For example, there's the Dendra Panoply, which you might have seen online. Right there, that helmet is a boar's tusk helmet, the very sort of helmet which is literally described in the Iliad. But you know what, I can understand that not everybody might like the look of such a helmet, even though I think it's kind of cool. And also, not everybody in Bronze Age Greece would have worn that. It was probably pretty expensive. So we do instead have a vase from Mycenae itself, the city itself, that depicts soldiers in the time period the Iliad and the Odyssey would have taken place. This is called the Warrior Vase. Now, for people who like sword and sandals epics, you might realize that armor there is very similar to the armor that costume designers made for the movie Troy 20 years ago. Which, despite some undeserved criticism, is a pretty great movie. So they could have gone that route. Instead, they kind of went a route of kind of the stereotypical, gritty, Hollywood ancient Greece, right? So we can see that in this image of Odysseus, which was the first image released for the movie. So on the one hand, Christopher Nolan is using a fantastical costume aesthetic for characters like Agamemnon, who are not gods or anything, they're just normal people. But then Odysseus gets sort of like a leather, a gritty, dirty outfit, which makes more sense for Christopher Nolan to create because Christopher Nolan uses the quote-unquote realistic aesthetic. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't really care very much if a historical fantasy movie is historically accurate. You can just say it takes place in a fantasy world, right? I don't really necessarily agree with that, but you could say that. Immortals is an example of a similar genre movie that looks amazing. There's a lot of good costume choices, a lot of good character design, but it has absolutely zero historical accuracy to it. I think the movie takes place in Thebes, and the set for Thebes does not match Thebes at all. The issue with Immortals, though, is of course the plot was crap, so whatever. But my point is that these are creative decisions that these directors are choosing, and they could be evaluated on their own merits, right? So obviously the Odyssey movie is not very historically accurate, clearly, but also the creative decisions don't look very good. Let's fast forward a little bit. Okay, so we get Odysseus recounting that he has a wife and he has a son, and then we see Tom Holland, who's supposed to be his son, on a boat. Now, this was in some headlines and some articles, but Christopher Nolan decided to use, for some reason, a Viking longship for his Greek ships in this movie. There's a lot of evidence we have for the sorts of boats people used back then. I'm not an expert on nautical history, so I'm sure the Greeks had boats that looked vaguely similar to the one that Christopher Nolan is using. Yeah, here we see another shot of the longboat they used.
Not great, not terrible.
Here we can also see the Acropolis that's supposed to be in Ithaca, which is Odysseus' hometown, basically. I don't think that's very historically accurate. That doesn't look like the sort of Acropolis or fortress that you might find in Bronze Age Greece. I wonder if that's actually a real set that they're using. We actually have photographs of an archaeological site, which may have been the palace or building that Odysseus, if he was real, would have lived in, and it doesn't look very similar. Now, of course, like we keep talking about, this is a more fantastical aesthetic, so I'm not going to complain too much about what Ithaca looks like in the trailer. Okay, then we get a shot of Polyphemus, the Cyclops that everyone knows about that Odysseus confronted. I think it looks pretty good. No notes, we can move on. Here is something that everyone keeps bringing up. Robert Pattinson's character, who's one of the suitors who's pursuing Odysseus' wife, says you're pining for a daddy you didn't even know, like some sniveling boy. So, on the one hand, just in a trailer, you don't really get pulled into a movie very much, so it kind of seems very bizarre for someone to talk like that. But then again, they weren't speaking English in real life. They were speaking some ancient Bronze Age Greek dialect on the one hand. On the other hand, again, this is a creative decision, right? So he's creatively deciding that the dialogue is going to be more naturalistic, more modern, and I think that's a bad creative decision. Sometimes it's nice to have someone speak a little bit more elevated. I'm not going to, pick the movie to death over the accent of the characters who should be ancient Greeks, right? But, there is an argument to be made that having a sort of a elevated tone pulls you into the setting more, right? In the movie Troy, Brad Pitt's character doesn't speak in an American accent. He's kind of trying to do a British accent. He doesn't really do it very well, but I think it works better than just speaking in an American accent and saying such a dialogue as, you're pining for a daddy you didn't even know. I don't know. Maybe I have to watch the movie to find out whether or not it works. Here we see a bunch of Greeks running across a beach away from the tree line of a, looks like Northern European pine forest. Again, this might be the same set where they get confronted by those Lastragonian guys, which was supposed to be Sicily, by the way. Sicily does not look like that. That looks like Northern Europe. Again, this might be following that theory that the Odyssey took place in the Baltic and not the Mediterranean, because this does not look like a Mediterranean climate. And you know what? That's a creative choice, so maybe he just doesn't really care, but it kind of takes away from the vibe, right? Because the whole point of the Odyssey is he's sailing through the Mediterranean, and he's visiting all these islands which are still places in real life. If you take the Mediterranean out of the Odyssey, what are you left with? Actually, it looks like they're running from Polyphemus in this shot. And then we have a shot of, if you remember the story, so Odysseus has to narrowly navigate between Charybdis, which is a giant whirlpool, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, and then there's Scylla above, which is a big snake monster that has a bunch of heads that reaches down, so they have to navigate between the two. That does not look very difficult in this story. They could just... That whirlpool... I don't understand why he's going for a muted, reduced choice for a giant whirlpool, which is supposed to be very threatening and dangerous. Do you remember that one Pirates of the Caribbean movie with a giant whirlpool with a kraken? That's what it's supposed to look like. I care that it doesn't look, scary. Maybe this occurs earlier on in the movie, and they want to build up to greater threats later on. That's the only thing that would make sense to me. Because why not just go all out? It's CGI anyways, just make a bigger, scarier looking whirlpool. Okay, so that's basically all the interesting stuff that I want to talk about in these trailers, except for one last issue, which is race. So a lot of people are angry that there are black people in this movie. Other people are saying, well, you gotta have completely race-blind casting. Any character could be black, any character could be any ethnicity, because it's a fantasy movie, right? I'm gonna present a bit of a nuanced take. So obviously, first of all, it is a fantasy movie, so I guess it's not that deep. It doesn't really matter. This is a modern day movie, a modern day commercial project in 2026, and people who are not white like to see people who are their race in movies. These movie studios have to sell tickets, and that's one way to make sure people feel a connection to your movie, so you make money. That's one thing. On the other hand, there's ways to have people of color in your movie, and not just be completely race blind. In ancient Bronze Age Greece, I don't think there were many black Ithacans walking around. That's just the truth. Ancient Greece was not as cosmopolitan as modern-day New York City or Los Angeles. That's just the truth. But on the other hand, there were people who were not white in the Mediterranean in this time period. There were black people in the Trojan War. There was an Ethiopian king who brought his soldiers up and came to Troy's defense against the Greeks. So there would have been black people in this war. And maybe some of them, when the city fell, changed teams to Odysseus' side or something like that. The Mediterranean was a big place, and you can imagine that some black people would have ended up in Greece, some obviously ended up in Troy according to the story, so it makes sense for there to be black people in this movie. You can actually try to respect the characters in this film by providing an explanation. In the old Gladiator movie, there was an African character, and it made sense for him to be African because he was supposed to be from Africa. He was a Numidian character who ended up in the gladiator pits, which makes perfect sense for ancient Rome, which was a vast empire that had lots of different people in it. But here's the thing though, so obviously this movie is not really doing that. I think they're just kind of randomly casting the extras to be black or Indian or whatever, and they're not really considering why they might be that way, what their stories are. They're just kind of, swapping random Greeks to be different races. Kind of like the House of the Dragon series, where one of the branches of a family is just randomly black. I think it's supposed to be so you could tell the difference because they're all kind of similar characters, but for some reason this family, which is half white and then half black. How do they become half black? Is that half the family from a specific continent? What happened there? It's a fantasy story where every father, every son, every cousin is tracked in detail. Why not have one be from the continent that has black people on it? That's one explanation you could do, but they decide not to do that. There's no explanation at all. It just happens. Obviously this isn't a big deal to me. I don't really care very much if a character's black or what, but I kind of feel like they're missing opportunities to explore the storytelling more. Isn't it kind of interesting that an Ethiopian king partook in the Trojan War, that he brought his men up there and he fought for Troy? That's something you could explain. You could have Ethiopian characters. That would be interesting. Instead, they have Greek characters who happen to be black. And I think that's a disservice to the storytelling in the movie. You're missing an opportunity to do something interesting, to do something creative. It's just a missed opportunity. So again, to summarize my thoughts, Christopher Nolan obviously makes pretty good movies. I don't think I've really disliked any Christopher Nolan movie very much. So obviously the story, I imagine, is going to be fine. It's going to be a good movie. But a lot of the creative choices are just kind of bizarre. It seems to me a lot of the creative choices just aren't very good. That's all I have to say about it. If you want to support the channel, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow. Thanks to those who already do, and adios.